So, for some context, one of my friends used to have a pen pal who lived in Michigan. Now, the pen pal, his name was Henry. Henry was basically 16 years old, and he encountered something very surprising. No, it's not your typical kidnapping story or anything like that, but it was something that Henry discovered when he was in Michigan. Since the pen pal Henry had, his name was Adrian. Adrian, who was 16 at the time, was sending letters to his pen pal Henry. Now, Henry told this story to Adrian, and it happened sometime in 2014 in the summer. In Michigan, Henry lived in a pretty area in the outskirts. He was living with his grandparents due to the fact that his biological dad and his mother had divorced, and neither of them could take him in due to the fact that they were not financially stable to look after another mouth to feed and etc. So Henry was living with his grandparents, who were basically in their late 60s, early 70s, but it was not bad at all. Henry was only 16, and he was going to be moving out, or at least he'll be able to live on his own once he turns 18. One of these times that Henry went into the woods, that was behind his grandparents' house. Since it was in the outskirts, there was a large forest area behind him, and there were barely any neighbors around. Well, there were a couple neighbors, but he doesn't really see them or talk to them often. Since Henry was living in the outskirts, his grandparents would drive him to places such as school, probably grocery stores, and etc. One of the nights in the summer, though, Henry discovered something really shocking. So, he decided to have a sleepover with one of his friends, which his name was Simon. Simon and Henry got along pretty well ever since freshman year of high school. Simon decided to stay overnight at Henry's place one weekend, as Henry didn't have school during the weekend and he was off on Friday. So, with that said, Simon and Henry decided to spend pretty much most of the day together. They were outside in the backyard, which was near to the wooded area, where they decided to take what seems to be a notebook. Now, Henry decided to write some stuff down, as he had a project coming up for school that was due sometime in the next week. So, Henry and Simon decided to go venture in the forest, with, of course, knowledge that where they were going to be. Henry went back inside to let his grandparents know where he and Simon were going to be. His grandparents told him not to wander off too far, but to come back at a certain time. Since Henry knew the trails very well, he and Simon go on them quite frequently. They were going on the trail that from the very backyard all the way to somewhere in the forest. They were walking through the forest, and since it was a little cloudy due to the fact that it looked like it was going to rain soon. Now, take it by the fact that it wasn't nighttime or anything like that, it started to get foggy around the area. Now, there wasn't really too many bushes in the area where they were taking a trail, but it wasn't that bad. They would sometimes see people on their bikes, other hikers, even some people walking their dogs in the area, and there was no problem with them at all. They were usually very cool with it, as most of the neighbors were people that Henry and Simon knew. However, as they were walking through the forest, Henry was taking some notes on some pretty interesting flowers that he came across, as well as some plants. He was pretty much into a lot of biology stuff, so he basically liked to do that. Since he had his cell phone with him, he took pictures of it too, so he could analyze the photos and stuff. However, Simon looked over to his right to see what seemed to be a shadow sticking out from one of the trees. He pointed at it when he tapped on Henry's shoulder. "Do you see that over there?" Simon asked. Henry looked up to see what it was, but he couldn't really get a good look. He assumed that maybe it must have been another hiker in the woods, or possibly some wild animal. They sometimes would get wolves, coyotes around the areas, occasionally a bear every now and then. But whatever it was seemed to have a really weird shape. Henry looked over, but it didn't seem to look like a coyote or a wolf, but it was pretty much over 6 feet tall. At first, Simon might have assumed that it might have been a bear and they were going to have to get out of there, as they do occasionally come across bears on the trail. But of course, it didn't look like a bear at all. Whatever it was walking on 2 hind legs, and it had really long claws. It kind of looked like a bear, but Henry realized that whatever it had then stared at them with red eyes. It suddenly let out a low growl before it ended up walking away from them. Of course, Simon and Henry decided to go find out what it is, so they eventually followed it. When they thought they lost it in through the fog, they began to start making some noise, basically telling it whatever it was to come out. They had some pranksters who were pulling out pranks by dressing up in various animals just to try to scare locals away. This was common in the area, so Henry, along with Simon, were making noises, trying to get this beast's attention. After mimicking the sounds, whatever it was came out of the far away in the fog. Of course, they couldn't really see any facial expression, but it let out aggressive growls and snarls. This was the cue for Henry and Simon to get out of there. Since they ran as fast as they could, they ran all the way back up until they were back to Henry's backyard. By the time they got there, they ran inside and locked the door and stayed inside for the remainder of the day. They at first thought that it might have been a bear, but it didn't look like a bear when it charged at them. Still to this day, they never told Henry's grandparents about what they saw in the woods, thinking that they wouldn't believe in Henry. Henry doesn't even know if that was a bear or something else. But they never went into those woods again. Well, at least unless if they were with a group of people. But they never went in just the 2 of them again. This took place at a hunting camping trip, and this happened to one of my neighbors who went to Michigan in the summer of 2016. His name was Lachlan. Lachlan was around his early 30s, and he and his kids liked to go camping together. His wife, Adriana, used to love hunting with him. They have 2 kids. Of course, they were both girls, and they were aged 9 and 10. Now, at the time of this story, they had never went camping after this incident. So, at the time of this story, they decided to go to Michigan to spend a month there, and it was shortly after the kids had gone out of school. They went to one of the biggest, most popular camping places in Michigan. It was one of the places where they allowed hunting and etc. Their first night there, they unpacked, set up their tents, and they even cooked up dinner. As soon as they were all ready, they ended up hearing what seemed to be some howling in the distance. Now, Lachlan knew that they were mainly just wolves and possibly coyotes, as there were a lot of them in the area. So they ended up not thinking of it and just went to sleep. However, when they woke up, they decided to go for a hike in the woods. After they had breakfast, they all decided to go hunting, fishing at the same time while they were on their hike. Of course, Adriana took the girls, while Lachlan took one of them. His oldest daughter's name was Samantha. She was learning how to hunt, and ever since she was 6 years old, she'd watch a lot of nature shows that have to do with hunting and etc. They were hiking for quite some time, until Lachlan found a perfect hunting spot. There were a couple of hunting towers in the area, so he decided to pick a very simple but easy spot for Samantha. Samantha got her gun, and she pointed the gun at whatever it was. It was something black, it was hunched over, and they even thought that it might have been an elk, but they couldn't really be for sure. Of course, Samantha took the shot, and it hit whatever it was. Then whatever it was stood on two hind legs, and it looked nothing like any deer or elk. It looked like if it was a bear until it turned around. It didn't even look like one at all. It even probably somewhat looked like a bear, and that was Lachlan's guess. But that possibility had problems as well, as it had what seemed to be a tail of a dog. Whatever it was standing about 50 feet away from them, let out a screeching howl and snarl and roar, causing Lachlan and Samantha to run. They didn't even look back until they got to the campsite, but once they do, they waited in the tent for a while, hoping and praying to God whatever that thing was that would not follow them. Eventually, Adriana and their other daughter came back safely, but when Lachlan told them about what happened, they immediately packed up their things and they reported it to the ranger as soon as they left. The authorities were even contacted, but the description of whatever Lachlan gave was nothing that they could ever find. Of course, they looked everywhere in the area. Of course, the rangers have no idea what that creature was, and Lachlan is praying to God that whatever it was never to be seen again in Michigan. He doesn't even know if those things were some sort of prank or whatever it was really real. He doesn't even want to know what that creature was, and he doesn't want to find out. One of my friends' names, we'll call her Julie. Now, Julie used to live in Michigan, and this happened sometime, I guess, in the mid-2000s. Probably 2006 in the summer. She was living in Michigan with her aunt and uncle, as both of her parents had unfortunately had some difficult situations that led them to divorcing, and one of them was her mother, who was a drug addict, and her father was verbally and physically abusive. So in that case, Julie's younger brother, who was about 10 at the time, and she was 14, ended up living with their aunt and uncle, who was living in Michigan. Of course, they didn't have any kids, as they chose not to, but had some pets. Now, one of the nights, it was during the summer of 2006, probably around August, they had a block party on one day, and it was the day before Garbage Day, as the block party was being held in one of their areas. Julie loved doing block parties ever since she was a kid, and she grew up to love block parties. They were having a fun time at the block party by eating the food, hanging out with other kids around the neighborhood, and etc. Some of the kids there were people that Julie went to school with. However, one of the nights was honestly something terrifying that Julie experienced. Now, since she was 14, her aunt and uncle were sleeping as Julie was up late at night. Normally, this wasn't an issue if she didn't have any school going on, so it was quite normal. Julie was doing her usual school routine. Not really school routine, but you could kind of say her usual routine in the summer when she didn't have school. She was pretty much just as reading her books, or even sometimes color and watching TV. She was watching an episode of SpongeBob or something. It was on one of the DVDs that she had. She ended up looking outside, and she could hear something knocked over. Since it was a day before Garbage Day, she heard what seemed to be someone knocking a trash can over. Now, sometimes they would get bears in the area, which was quite rare, so she thought it might have been a bear who knocked over one of the neighbors' trash cans. However, when she walked outside, she couldn't see anyone, so she only saw the trash can was knocked over, and something hunched over and crouching down. She headed back inside and locked the door, and she thought that maybe it might have been a bear and didn't want to risk approaching it, as bears can be very aggressive at this time. However, she decided to go wake up her aunt and uncle about it. Her aunt and uncle woke up, and they ended up going over to the front door to see whatever it was, then stood up. It then slowly turned its body and was staring at the door. It didn't look like a bear because it was on a stance ready to attack. Then suddenly, Julie was quite serious about the situation, and she honestly had no idea what this thing was, and she was panicking on the inside. It was around 1 a.m., so Julie's aunt took Julie up to the bedroom where she called the cops. Julie's uncle was downstairs and was monitoring him, whatever that thing was outside, had his magnum in hand. He had carried this magnum since he worked in the army, and he was ready to attack whatever it was if it ever tried to break in. It looked like some sort of werewolf costume, but yet again, it looked too real to be a costume. One of the neighbors was screaming at whatever it was, then suddenly took off running into the darkness of the streets. The cops eventually came, but they didn't find any trace of whatever that werewolf thing was. Now at night, Julie, ever so slightly, thinks about this every now and then. What could have happened if she was out there with that thing? Chances were she wouldn't be here by now. But every time Julie thinks about this night in Michigan, she really thinks that whatever this was probably some sort of cryptic creature. Of course, her aunt and uncle never speaks of this so much, as they both get petrified every time they think about it. But since that day, Julie has never saw that thing again.